start with just a question or an exercise for you to think about. And for those of you who are not familiar with psychological safety, I put the definition up here for you, which is the belief that a team or an organization or an entity of some kind is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So I want you to imagine that an organization has hired you to decide whether it is psychologically safe. So you administer a psychological safety survey and you find a mean of 5.9 out of 7. Is this a psychologically safe organization? If you're the CEO, what would you conclude? I'd be pretty happy with that, right? Now imagine you dig into the data a little bit more, and what you find is that the average for white employees is 6.4, and the average for employees of color is 4.3. Is this a psychologically safe organization?
No.
This question sort of lies at the center of our talk today. So as Tatiana mentioned, my name is Jessica Diaz. I'm an assistant professor in organizational psychology here at Claremont. I also teach statistics and see many of my wonderful students in the room. And the talk today is called Psychological Safety Isn't Neutral. How does identity, power, and the conditions for flourishing? Now, we're going to tackle 3 questions today. The first, in the spirit of the conference, is why does psychological safety matter for flourishing? It sounds intuitive, but interestingly, the positive psych literature and the psychological safety literature actually rarely talk to each other. The second question, though, which is the bulk of our talk, is why might psychological safety not be distributed evenly? So what differences do we see in psychological safety? And here we're going to look at several research studies, some that I've conducted, some that my students have conducted, that really show how psychological safety varies as a function of social identity. And then last but not least, we can't end without talking about, well, okay, what do organizations do about it? So let's start with this first question. What does psychological safety have to do with flourishing at all? So when you think about flourishing, what words come to mind?
Happiness.
Happiness.
Well-being.
Well-being.
Growth.
Growth.
Purpose.
Purpose.
Hope.
Hope. Good. So when we look across the literature on flourishing, I heard a couple of these: growth. We also see research that points to the importance of belonging. So when we look at PERMA and positive relationships, or we look at self-determination theory and relatedness, the ability to belong, the ability to be authentic and contribute positively to those around us. Well, at the center of that, though suspiciously absent in the literature, is this idea of psychological safety. If we want contribution, growth, belonging, and authenticity, then what facilitates that? And one of my arguments is that psychological safety is one of those core facilitators of the conditions of flourishing. But interestingly, if we go to the psych safety literature, these terms don't exist. So a quick, very quick, I promise, history on psychological safety, where it came from, how it's grown, and where it is today. So interestingly enough, psychological safety actually started in the organizational change literature. So Shine and Bennis in the 60s proposed that if you want to enact change in an organization of any type, you have to create a safety culture. You have to have safety that enables people to let go of what they're used to and embrace things that are new. Kahn, in the 1990s, then expanded our understanding of psychological safety to talk about safety as an enabler of employee engagement. So Kahn is famous for his work on employee engagement and posited that in order to be able to engage fully, physically, emotionally, etc., we had to have some sense of safety. But psychological safety didn't really see its time in the literature until Amy Edmondson came around in the 1990s and studied what enables teams to learn, to innovate, and to grow. And her sort of seminal study in 1999 was looking at a group of manufacturing teams and found that teams that had the highest levels of psychological safety were able to initiate the most growth and innovation. And since the emergence of psychological safety, we've had over 20 years of tons of psychological safety literature, but nearly all of it focuses on what I call performance-based outcomes, right? So innovation, creativity, performance, problem solving, learning, things that ultimately help individuals and organizations perform. Now, here's where we can take a page from Positive Psychology's book. If we expand psych safety to think about its role in happiness, meaningfulness, and thriving, right, we can position psych safety as a key mechanism towards flourishing. Safety predicts not just performance, but in recent years, we start to see psych safety positioned as a lever or mechanism for employee well-being, which is where my research sits. However, we've still been studying psychological safety in a really myopic way, right? If you are psychologically safe, that increases well-being. If we think about the third wave of positive psychology, which says, okay, well-being does not just arrive from individuals, it's actually shaped. It's shaped by context, it's shaped by culture, and most important and relevant for today's talk, it's shaped by social identity, right? Who you are and the groups that you belong to. If we think about it from that perspective, it requires us to take a new look at psychological safety and sort of ask the question, well, who is able to feel psychologically safe in organizations? Now, an interesting practice versus research problem, which often comes up in our field. If you look at psychological safety in organizations, this frame is talked about, right? Especially following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, organizations started talking about psychological safety as the ability to be oneself, as the ability to bring one's full self to work as it related to identity. But if you look at the literature on psych safety, the scholarship, it is virtually identity agnostic, right? It treats psych safety as if it is facilitated and experienced equally by everyone. Only in kind of the last, honestly, 3 to 4 years have we started to see actual research on psych safety and its intersection with social identity. So why might psychological safety be unequally distributed in organizations? Well, quick background, if we go back to social identity theory originating with Tajfal and Turner in '79, social identity theory says that we derive a part of our self-concept, our self-esteem, from the social groups that we belong to, right? However, there's a related construct in the social identity literature called social identity threat, which describes a concern, either real, so it's really happening, or perceived, I worry it might happen, that we might be judged or treated or devalued based on that specific social identity. And when that happens, we are essentially erasing the lived experience and narrative of groups of people and organizations. So thinking about this idea of psych safety as required for flourishing and the threatening role of social identity threat, I wanted to discover sort of where is that link there and what impact does it have in organizations. So I'm going to overview a few pieces of research that are conducted by myself and members of my lab that sort of dive into this essential question, right? Is social identity experienced differently across groups of people, and why might that be? So this all comes, don't worry about digesting this slide. This all comes from a new theory that I've been working on over the past few years, which is the social identity theory of psych safety. And this theory essentially says what happens in an environment that triggers social identity threat, thereby reducing psychological safety. And how do we interrupt those processes at different points? Either by preventing social identity threat from arising in the first place, or once social identity threat has arisen, how do we preserve psychological safety once it's there? Okay, so this is kind of the whole theory that has then spawned several pieces of research asking this question. So study one is very simple in concept and very not simple in design. Okay, so we're going to talk about simple in concept first, which is, this is the core link, right? When social identity threat happens for individuals and organizations, psychological safety will go down. Now, the question is why? And we can look at Lazarus-Folkman's theory of stress. We can also look at what happens when social identity arises from the social identity threat literature. And what the literature posits, and this is Steele's 2002 work, is that when social identity threat happens, it actually triggers a set of 3 intra-individual cognitive processes. So 3 things that happen in our mind once we experience social identity threat. The first is a simple stress arousal, right? When we experience social identity threat, we stress. The second is hypervigilance. So when we experience social identity threat, we are then on the lookout for additional sources of stress. What does that do? It takes away our cognitive and emotional resources that we might otherwise devote to other areas of our work. And then the third is self-monitoring and self-regulation. If I'm experiencing social identity threat in my organization, then I am then paying attention to the way I carry myself, the things that I say, right, the actions that I take in an effort to protect myself from additional threat. And that self-monitoring and self-regulation automatically makes me less safe to take interpersonal risks, right? I am thereby not willing to take interpersonal risks that may run the risk of inviting additional identity threat. So that's kind of the core mechanism that links these two. Now, this study, the aim was to test this relationship. And as I mentioned, I teach statistics, right? Which means I really wanted to establish a causal relationship between these. However, I wanted to study this with real people who are working in organizations. And as those of you who do research know, it is very hard to have both, right? It is hard to get real people in organizations and ask them about their experience and be able to draw causal conclusions from that, short of a field experiment where you manipulate social identity threat, which I did not want to do. So what we did was we used a really interesting analytical technique, which I am going to tangent and explain a little bit for my stats nerds in the room. But the first study was a sample of 386 working professionals. It was about a little over half men, and on purpose, we collected an even racial split. So half of our sample were white employees, half of our sample identified as employees of color. And the only 2 things that we measured in this study were psychological safety and social identity threat. Now, how on earth did we ask people about psych safety and social identity threat and be able to make causal inferences about that? After I've told half of you for a year that you can't collect correlational data and make causal inferences. Well, there is one way, okay? So, we used a type of modeling called random intercept cross-lag panel modeling. Very long, okay? And I am going to attempt to teach you this in very brief so that you can understand how this works. You're all like, I'm never going to get it. I promise you'll get it, okay? So, what we did was we collected psychological safety and social identity threat 4 times. So every week we collected both variables from the same set of working employees. Now, to understand how this model works, I want you to zoom in just on psychological safety in week 3, okay? So all we're trying to do here is predict psychological safety in week 3. Well, what are the potential sources of psychological safety in week 3? The reason that we cannot make causal conclusions from observational data is because with observational data, we are not able to explain all of the causes of an outcome, right? This model actually allows us to do that. So let's look at all of the causes for psychological safety in week 3? Well, the first, and this is the one I really care about, is social identity threat, the week before, right? So as you experience social identity threat in week 2, that, in theory, should decrease your psychological safety the following week. However, that's not the only source. And in a correlational study, this is all we'd get, right? We'd get a correlation between social identity threat and psych safety. However, one of the other causes is our psych safety from last week, right? We call this the carryover effect. So however psychological safe I felt last week, that's gonna have some impact on the psychological safety I feel this week. But that's not the only cause, right? There are other things that happen in my environment in that week that are gonna impact both my psychological safety and my social identity threat. We call those environmental shocks. So let's say I'm sitting at my cubicle in week 3 and my leader comes and starts yelling at everybody in the department, right? That is going to uniformly impact both my psychological safety and my social identity threat in that week. But we're missing a massive group of causes that are not yet explained in this model. What are they? Any of my stat students? What are other things that might explain my psych safety that aren't here right now?
Individual differences.
Individual differences, absolutely. My gender, right? My race, my experience, my level in my organization, my performance, anything that belongs uniquely to me that makes my psychological safety different than your psychological safety. This is where the coolness of this model comes in, right? Which is that all of that additional variance that is belonging to the individual is soaked up into what we call a random intercept, or a starting point. With this random intercept, right? We won't go to that one yet, that's scarier. With this random intercept, all of the other variance in psychological safety is now explained. So at this point, between who I am, what my psych safety looked like last week, what happened in my organization this week, and my social identity threat, we've identified and covered all of the sources of variance in psychological safety, which allows us to make causal inferences about that cross-line path. You want to learn more? Happy to teach you later. Okay, this is what that model looks like in its entirety. We're not going to stay on this because there's too many lines, okay? But it's just this exact relationship modeled across all 4 weeks. So you want to know the results? Okay. So we're just going to look at this. Much simpler, right? Just psych safety and social identity threat. All right. So the first thing that we found in this study is that higher social identity threat does in fact lead to lower psych safety over time. Okay, so the beta was negative 0.09, that's significant. For those of you who do not know stats, the reason that you don't see little significant stars here is because we use confidence intervals. When that confidence interval does not contain 0, we can infer that path is significant. So we did find a negative and significant relationship between social identity threat in 1 week and subsequent psychological safety the week later. Although we weren't looking for it, we also found the opposite. Right? So your psychological safety actually predicts lower social identity threat the following week, which I think is interesting because it positions not just psychological safety as an outcome, but actually also positions psychological safety as an intervention technique for reducing social identity threat. Now, remember when I told you that that sample was split, half white, half people of color? These are the results for everybody. Right? Now, when I'm thinking about the role of identity threat and who experiences identity threat in organizations, I wanted to take this one step further and dive into racial differences in this model. So here they are, okay? The white figurine represents white employees, the blue figurine represents employees of color, and to make it very simple, let me show you what I found. Nothing for white participants. No relationship between social identity threat and psych safety. No relationship between psych safety and social identity threat. The entire relationship amongst all 386 people was driven by employees of color, right? Meaning, employees of color are experiencing lower psychological safety that arises from identity threat and vice versa, but this impact, this effect, can't be seen for white employees in this sample. So once I established kind of that core mechanism of my theory or my model, I had other questions, right? Well, okay, why does this matter? What does psychological safety actually do? And potentially, as importantly, what creates that social identity threat in the first place in organizations? And from there, I added two pieces to this study. The first was, well, what does psychological safety drive? And I was particularly interested in inclusion, since a lot of my research looks at the intersection of identity and psychological safety, or identity and employee experience. And so we looked at, does there a relationship here between psychological safety and inclusion? And then that second piece was looking at the literature on social identity threat and asking a question, well, from what does social identity threat arise? And the research tells us that we have what are called identity activating cues, right? These are cues in our environment, could be an organizational environment, could be a classroom environment, that either signal identity threat or identity safety. And I was interested in looking at specific organizational cues that might signal social identity threat. Now, there are a lot of them, right? But when I thought about picking the ones I wanted to look at, I was really interested in looking at identity cues that aren't intrinsically bad, right? So for example, we could look at cues like microaggressions. We know that those are identity devaluing. But what about things that we often tout as helpful in an organization that may be having an unintended effect? So in this particular study, I looked at two identity activating cues that maybe on their surface seem positive or at least neutral, but maybe having an impact on identity threat that we're not paying attention to. The first is hierarchy, okay? So we often look at organizations and the concept of initiating structure, and we talk about at least some degree of hierarchy being helpful for performance and efficiency. And I was interested in, okay, maybe it's great for performance and efficiency, but what relationship does it have with social identity threat and psychological safety? The second that I was interested in is what we call work group cultures of conformity. So this comes from Hugh Lin's work on facades of conformity, which is the idea that we often suppress who we are to fit into a group, right? And a culture of conformity is a group where generally people operate in the same way, right? Sometimes, if we're being naive, we say, ooh, team cohesion, right? But what we're really talking about are work groups that sound the same, look the same, act the same, dress the same, right? We've often worked in these work groups where everybody starts to function in sort of a similar way. So I was interested in how these two things impact social identity threat and ultimately psychological safety. But wouldn't be positive psychology if we weren't asking, well, how do we interrupt that, right? We can't stay with the problem. And so I also looked at two what I call threat interrupters. So these are identity safety signaling ideas that might be able to disrupt the effect of these two organizational cues on social identity threat. The first was BIPOC representation and leadership. So I asked individuals to report the percentage of mid-level managers at their organization who identified as a person of color. And then I asked them to identify the percentage of executives who identified as a person of color. And I modeled those as a latent construct of BIPOC representation and leadership. The second one I looked at was inclusive leadership. So if you have an inclusive leader who runs a team that has high culture of conformity, can they actually disrupt that conformity to a point where people no longer experience identity threat? So this is the full model that comes out of that core mechanism from study 1. Again, about 386 people, a split sample, just like study 1. And then you have the measures and some sample items up here. We also, of course, measured social identity threat and psych safety, but I didn't put them on there because it's the same as study 1. All right. before I get to that part. Okay, so just like in study 1, I wasn't really interested in an overall relationship here because I think an overall relationship hides the mechanisms that we're actually interested in looking at. So instead, what I wanted to know was, does this work differently depending on your racial identity? And in order to do that, I ran 2 models, okay? The first in stats is what we call a constrained model. This is where we forced the parameters, the paths, the relationships to be the same for white employees and for employees of color. In the second model, we fit what's called an unconstrained model. So we allowed those paths to be different based on an individual's racial identity. And the way you figure out which one makes sense in the world is you fit them against each other. And the model that fits better tells you whether there are differences in these relationships or whether the relationships operate the same. And what we find is that there are in fact differences. So the unconstrained model fits far better than the constrained model, which means that the relationships between what we're looking at are different for employees of color than they are for white employees. So let's look at them. Let's start with white participants, okay? So here's the relationships that we found for white participants. And to draw your attention to a couple of interesting things, work group cultures of conformity and hierarchical structures still created social identity threat for white participants. Now, this is beyond kind of the scope of this talk, but there are types of social identity threat that are unique to prototypical groups, to white individuals, that might help explain why this relationship held. However, the core thing that we notice here, which replicates what we saw in study 1, is that there's no relationship between that social identity threat and psychological safety. So as a white employee, I might experience social identity threat, but it is short-lived, right? It does not then impact my psychological safety down the line. Not surprisingly, none of these moderators worked for white employees. So BIPOC representation in leadership nor inclusive leadership had any effect on the relationship between those environmental cues and social identity threat. However, for employees of color, it was a very different story. So here are the relationship for employees of color. There's no markings on this page because every relationship is significant. So social identity threat continued to have a negative effect on psychological safety in the coming week. Work group cultures of conformity and hierarchy negatively contributed to social identity threat, but what's important is that both representation and leadership helped attenuate those effects. And if you want to see that visually, and also because my statistics students would kill me if I didn't have moderation graphs, okay? Here's what it looks like. So for inclusive leadership, that dotted line, oops, it's like the font didn't come through. That dotted line is what it looks like when inclusive leadership is high. So that relationship between cultures of conformity and social identity threat gets flatter or weaker in the presence of an inclusive leader, okay? It doesn't go away. That's an important thing to pay attention to. It does not go away, but it does get weaker. BIPOC representation is even more interesting. So if you look again at that dotted line, let's start with the dashed line. So the dashed line in the middle is the general relationship between hierarchy and social identity threat. As hierarchy goes up, social identity threat also goes up. However, when BIPOC representation and leadership is high, so that dotted line, not only does the slope get flatter, the relationship get weaker, but it actually becomes non-significant. Meaning, when we have leadership representative of people of color, there is no longer a relationship between hierarchy and social identity threat at all, right? When we see leaders, right, when employees of color see leaders who look like them, hierarchy no longer impacts their social identity threat in a negative way. sort of 2 original studies, but in the last year, because I became really excited about what we found, there's been some additional evidence that has come out. It's all really preliminary. You're probably the first to hear it, but I'm excited to share. So the first is we said, okay, let's dig in a little bit more into that cultures of conformity piece. Why do work groups that have conformist cultures drive identity threat? And one of the questions we have was, do cultures of conformity make microaggressive behavior permissible, right? So when we work in a group that is conformist, do we see higher instances of microaggressions, right? Cultures of conformity drive this desire to fit in, right? We know from social identity theory that when we desire to fit in, we will often distance the group that is different from us in the form of microaggressive behavior, and that then decreases psychological safety. Okay? Conformity is not a neutral backdrop, right? It essentially weaves in pretense around who matters, whose voice is heard, and how do we treat those around us. And preliminary research shows that this is the case. So here again, we disaggregated the results into white participants and participants of color. And what we find, if you'll notice, no relationship again for white employees. Cultures of conformity do not drive racial microaggressions towards white employees, nor does that have an impact on psych safety, and inclusive leadership plays no role. However, for employees of color, cultures of conformity drive racial microaggressions, which then decreases psychological safety, and that ability of inclusive leadership to come in and interrupt that process persists here. Now, what does this mean? It means that 2 employees who are experiencing the same organizational culture are experiencing it in 2 very, very different ways. Now, the third piece of exciting research that I want to share was actually done by a student of mine who is in the room. If you are interested in political work or the politics around identity, this extends the research around identity threat and psychological safety away from race and into the realm of political identity. Okay? So looking at the relationship between political divisiveness, social identity threat, and psychological safety. So this mechanism that we're looking at, we hypothesize, is not race specific, right? It can actually apply to any deeply held, marginalized identity. And so if we look at some of the work that's happening right now, political polarization has become one of the most pressing identity relevant challenges in our current context. And so if we're thinking about a social justice approach to psychological safety and identity threat, we can't stop at race. We have to consider the kind of full range of identities that people might have. Now, this is preliminary, but these are some of her initial findings. And what we find is exactly what we expected to find, right? Which is that political polarization has a positive relationship with social identity threat. When we experience political polarization, our political social identity threats feel threatened, and that then drives lower psychological safety. All of our paths are significant here, as is our indirect effect. So the effect of political polarization on psych safety is, in fact, explained partially by social identity threat. And there are lots of extending research in here I would love to do around different marginalized identities, but it's been really neat to see that this core mechanism doesn't just apply to race, but actually to multiple identities that people hold. And Hannah and I have been talking about sort of applying an intersectional lens to this and looking at what happens for individuals who hold multiple identities in the workplace and how does this mechanism work. Okay, so last before we wrap up, well, what do we do about it? Well, there are several organizational levers that individuals and organizations can pull in order to help drive psychological safety by reducing identity threat. And they fall into 4 buckets. I lied. 4 buckets. The first is structure. The second is culture. The third is the way we measure psychological safety in organizations. And the last is borrowing from positive psychology and rethinking how we think about positive psychology interventions, both at small and large scale. So thinking about structure, right? We now know that flattening hierarchy, or at least ensuring representation and leadership, helps reduce social identity threat and psychological safety, and creating deliberate structures for employee voice, right? For employees to contribute in an upward manner, signal that they're not just their input, but also their identity is valued. And then from a culture perspective, being willing to name and disrupt conformist cultures. And that can certainly happen from within, from members of the work group, but we've also found through the research that leaders have a distinct power to be able to disrupt that. So inclusive leadership helps disrupt that effect of conformist cultures by saying, no, divergent opinions matter in this work group, right? And they're as valued as what is communicated by the group as a whole. And then reimagining PPIs as equity levers, rather than just conditions for flourishing or well-being, right? Thinking about small positive psychology interventions that actually can help drive psychological safety through the reduction of social identity threat. So to wrap up, before I take a couple questions, can I answer a couple questions? Great. When we think about really repositioning psychological safety, not just as a condition for flourishing, but as a condition for just and equitable flourishing, there are sort of three implications depending on where you sit in the work we all do together. So the first is for scholars, right? If you are a researcher, thinking about how identity belongs at the core, not adjacent to the work we do on psychological safety. And I would argue that psych safety is not the only construct in the field of organizational psychology that warrants a re-examination through the lens of social identity. If you are a practitioner, being sure that if you're interested in psychological safety, you are disaggregating your metrics, right? Rather than simply looking at psychological safety overall, you are looking at whether psychological safety is actually experienced differently based on the social identities that people hold, right? Audit your culture. Who sets the tone in your culture? Is there room for divergent thinking and divergent narrative? And then, over the course of these multiple studies, investing in inclusive leadership, right? Selecting for and developing inclusive leadership in organizations as a means of disrupting those environmental cues that signal social identity threat. And that last, for positive psychology as an entire field, really taking a page from the third wave work and looking at how identity and context may differentially affect how people experience flourishing and well-being. So rather than just saying flourishing, asking the question, flourishing for whom, right? And under one context. Why is this particularly important? So I'll give you a quick anecdote here, which is the first talk I ever did on this topic came very shortly after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And the framing of that talk was that we are currently at a point where organizations are pouring resources into equity and inclusion work, right? Our country has hit this racial reckoning. But when I went to go prepare this talk, that framing didn't work anymore. But it doesn't become unimportant. In fact, I think we've actually hit the third piece in this sort of arc of reckoning around social justice and racial equity. So when I started, we were here, right? We have this massive wave of commitment from organization. Psychological safety entered the conversation with a bang, right? How do we promote psychological safety so that people experience racial equity, right? In 21 to 23, we saw massive investment, not just psychological investment, but monetary investment. And unfortunately, we have hit this part of our arc, right? Which is that equity and inclusion and social justice are, without hyperbole, essentially under attack in our organizations, in our schools, across our country. Programs have been dismantled, language has been erased, right? I am lucky to live and work in California where I can give a talk like this. But I just got off the phone with a colleague who works in Arkansas, and she can't say the word race, okay? And so I think this talk comes actually at just an important time, if not a more important time, right? But talking about psychological safety and the way it's experienced across social identity allows us to do that work, not just in California, right, but in other places with the same goal, but a different set of vocabulary. As Hannah and I like to talk about, the idea of covert equity and inclusion, right? And I think this sort of presents one avenue for being able to work towards that goal. That is all I have. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take questions. Otherwise, thank you, Tatiana, for having me. Yes?
I'm wondering if you heard about the research done by Dr. Jeff Dyer on including intellectual honesty within psychological safety.
Including what?
Intellectual honesty.
Ah, interesting.
And so the notion that sometimes psychological safety becomes, well, let's just be nice.
Yes.
And so integrating, the notion of intellectual honesty into that, then you can have more innovation, etc.
Yeah, I think this idea of let's just be nice also illuminates another really interesting gap between research and practice, right? So if you look at the way we evaluate or measure psychological safety in research, it is not let's just be nice, right? In fact, I would say that the sort of most commonly used measure, which is Edmondson scale, actually captures some of that intellectual honesty, right? It's if I propose an idea, right, is it accepted? Can I disagree with the contributions of others, right? I think it's pretty well captured. But then what happens in practice is it very quickly gets diluted into either free to be who I am or let's be nice. And so I think it's also kind of a call for practitioners around educating people around what psychological safety really means, and then paying attention to the measures that they use to evaluate it in organizations. Because I think there's a lot of synergy there between intellectual honesty and how we should be thinking about psychological safety. AJ.
So I saw that a lot of your research, especially in the beginning phase, focused a lot more on the upward, so the mid-level managers and executives. Yeah. Is there anything in the literature that you've seen around same level peers, especially from the normative group or the dominant power group, when they call out? Yes. Right? That's the sort of behavior?
Yep. Two things. One, that's a study that I have on my plate. Let's talk. Right? He's my advisee, so let's talk. Two, yes, if you look at the allyship literature, right, that sort of, there isn't a lot of work directly connecting sort of prototypical allyship and psych safety explicitly, but I think there could be and should be. But allyship is one of those kind of same level levers that I think we can pull. You're right, the original research sort of looked at leadership as a lever for disrupting those, but I would be just as interested, and I think it potentially offers more pragmatic or practical implications if we're looking at that same level, either threat neutralizing or psych safety preserving interrupters. Yeah.
What kind of questions do you, congratulations on your work.
Oh, thank you.
What sort of questions do you have to get at the social identity threat issue?
Yeah, great question. So the social identity threat measures, and I didn't go into this in detail because this talk is short, but the social identity threat measure as it's originally conceptualized has two groups of questions, okay? The first group of question asks about the psychological experience. So for example, if we go back, I can show you one example that's on here. Maybe. If I go back a lot. Really a lot? But it will help to see an actual item of what it looks like. I have a lot of animation. This is a problem in my slides, as my students will tell you. Okay, so I feel that people's evaluations of my performance at work are affected by my race. Okay? Or people judge me. I feel like people judge me based on my racial identity. or people think that I am not as competent at my job because of my racial identity, okay? Now, there's two sets of items in the social identity measure. The first is that psychological experience. The second is what we call a perceived mistreatment. So I worry that people will actually do this to me because of my race. So you can almost think about that, if you're familiar with the microaggression literature, as like anticipated microaggressions. And when we look actually at microaggressions and social identity threat, you honestly can't even put them in studies together because they're so correlated, they're so high. So when I think about social identity threat, although the original scale has those two things, my psychological feeling of being devaluated based on a particular identity, and then the anticipated mistreatment based on that identity, I think that first one really captures the idea of social identity threat with more fidelity. So essentially, I feel like my identity is devalued in this context. And the key is to replace the specific focal identity that you're studying, right? So I feel people value me less because I am a Democrat or a Republican, right? I feel people value me less because I am a person of color.
I wonder if there's a way of, when you change the language, of making it broader.
Say more.
In the sense that people devalue me because I'm too young.
Yes.
Or I'm too old.
Yes.
Without actually having to put those specific words into the question.
Correct. Oh yeah, absolutely. I think so the way the scale works is you're able to change that referent in a way that makes sense for what you're interested in. So you could change it to a specific label, right? Like Democrat or Republican. But then what we would be learning is really truly around your identity as a Democrat or a Republican. You could ask the same question and say, because I hold liberal values versus I hold conservative values. But it could be age, I'm too young, I'm too old, right? It could be parental status, because I have kids, because I don't have kids, right? It allows you to sort of capture the identity threat you might experience based on any set of identities you want.
Well, could you do it in such a way that you said, because of who I am?
Yeah.
Or is that just too...
So you could, but that would invite a second question for me, which is, okay, these people felt devalued because of who they are. My next question is, well, what about who they are? Right? Yeah. So if you want to chat